So now let's look at raster encoding. The idea of raster encoding is converting discrete features, such as vector features, or even the real world directly, to raster layers. There are a number of methods in which we can encode. You've seen a couple just in the previous video. Two methods that are common are the Centroid methods, and this is what is used in the feature to raster tool in ArcGIS Pro, for example. And we'll see how that works. Then we have specialized methods where we can better control the process of encoding. And for analysis purposes, we should always be using the methods that are appropriate to the type of feature we want to encode into a raster. So for general visualization of things, the Centroid default method is okay. And that's again just for visualization. But for analytical purposes, we must make sure we control how things are encoded so that we don't have something unexpected happening at the end of our process in terms of the representation of the features that we are encoding into a raster. So let's have a look at these. So Centroid methods are easy to understand. Here, for example, in this graphic, we have some vector features. So that's the blue feature here, the yellow feature here at the bottom, and the green feature in the middle. Those particular vector features then have overlain upon that space a raster. And you can see the raster and the cell centers of each raster just there for illustrative purposes. So that's a cell in the raster, and that's the centroid or center of the cell. For the Centroid method, whatever falls or is intersected by the cell center, like this instance here, we have a green polygon that intersects the center, and so the output raster, the encoded raster, will have a green cell there. And one thing you can see immediately is that most of that cell is in fact nothing. It just so happens that that little green bit falls at the cell center, and so we have it being represented up top, whereas maybe in reality that would cause what's called over-representation. So over-representation. And that means simply that some group within the vector layer or real world is overrepresented in terms of its total area in the output. And then for the yellow areas, we have just these two cells because only two cells intersected the yellow, and those become up there. Here for the blue, again, that becomes the blue representation for this raster because only two cell centers intersected the blue. And so it looks like that. And so we can see a couple things here. In case of the blue, it's probably underrepresentation. So underrepresentation can also happen. And that again depends on our cell size. So with a smaller cell size, we could get better representation of those features. So the Centroid method has issues, and we should never blindly apply it when undertaking raster encoding. So we can also have, within the mixed pixel problem, subpixel issues. A subpixel issue is what we see here on the right, where we have two things that are different discrete objects in the same cell. We have A and B. A has the attribute blue and B has the attribute orange. So the question then is, what should the cell represent? Should it represent A, which is blue, or B, which is orange? Well, under the centroid method, whichever object intersects or is closest to the centroid of the cell, that cell will then represent that attribute or category, in this case blue. Blue is closest to the center. The centroid here is the black dot. And so then the cell would represent blue. because that's the object closest to the centroid. However, you might note by looking at it that blue is actually smaller in area than orange. So A is smaller than B in total area. So instead we could say, what is the largest object in the cell? It happens to be the orange one. So now we'll let the cell represent the orange one. And that's a choice that you make when you encode to raster. By default, again, the centroid method is used, but it's not necessarily going to be the best method for representing things according to how much of that thing is within a cell. The second part of the mixed pixel problem is the linear subpixel problem. Here, this occurs when we have a line that goes through a cell, or more than one line that goes through a cell. And those lines could represent streets, they could represent trails, they could represent the tracks of an animal, a migration route, it doesn't matter. They're just lines within a cell. Here we have a purple line, A, and a yellow line, B. So the question is, what should that cell represent? A, purple, or B, yellow? Again, we can come up with a rule very similar to the largest share rule that we looked at with the previous case. So if we look at these lines, one is 20 meters in length and one is 15 meters of length within that cell. So we could choose to represent the line that has the largest length inside the cell. In this case was A, the purple line, because it's 20 meters. Alternatively, if we use the centroid method, we would have B being represented by that cell. So that cell would become part of the line feature B, or yellow, just because yellow is closest to the center. And again, we would lose the ability at that point to know or have represented the most or the largest object within the cell. We can also have a boundary pixel issue that you see here. Very common when we have cells that overlie a contiguous set of polygons. Here we have A, B, and C. Three different types of polygons, blue, orange, and purple in this case. So what should the cell represent? Should it be blue, orange, or purple? Well, if we look at the proportions that each of those polygons take up within the cell, we can see that 45% of that cell is purple, 35% is blue, and 20% is orange. So we might then devise a rule whereby whatever takes up most of the cell, we will use that cell to represent that category, in this case purple. And that's because it has the largest proportion or greatest share within that particular cell. If we use the centroid method, we would get blue as the cell attribute, even though it is not the largest, taking up the largest amount of space within that cell. So that can be an issue in many cases. In other cases, we might have what we call a most important type. For a priori reasons, you may know that the orange area, any orange area up here, was underrepresented in the sampling that was used to create these polygons. And so you might add more weight to this orange area in here that could possibly bring it up above 45% in effect to have the cell represented as orange. And that's a more advanced way of thinking. That's called weighting the different classes. And you have to have some a priori knowledge in order to do that. But generally, we would use the largest share rule here, like we do in the case when we have two discrete objects within the cell. Finally, we have an intergrade issue. Intergrade issues are for continuous data. Remember, rasters are cells. Every cell has only one number in it. Even if it's measuring a quantitative variable, let's say like temperature. Here we have temperature ranging from 30 degrees Celsius to 0 degrees Celsius, and that goes across the cell. So right about in here, for example, it might be about 28 degrees, and here it might be about 3 degrees. And that's a range over the cell, isn't it? Now, the only way we could accurately represent the temperature truly at any point would be to have an infinitely small cell size. And we can't do that. It's not possible. So whenever we're representing a quantitative variable within raster cells, we must be cognizant of the fact that that quantitative variable has variability throughout the cell that is not represented by the raster itself. So what value could we use then when we have a cell or we're encoding some continuous variable in the real world into a raster representation? So what should the pixel represent? Should it be the maximum value, the minimum value, or perhaps something in between, like the mean value, the average? That would be somewhere in the middle here. So we could compute the average value of whatever environmental variable that's continuous that we're measuring and take the average of that, assuming that the environmental variable that we're measuring is a parametric value. That means that it's normally distributed across the cell space. Otherwise, we could use something like the median value instead. So the intergrade issue is one specific to continuous data. We also have the subpoint issue. So a pixel can contain more than one point. Here we have A and B with category red or label red or attribute red, D with green, and B with blue. So these are discrete point objects within a raster cell, and we want to represent them as a single, or want to represent the single cell as one of these. We can't have a cell with all attributes belonging to it. So what do we do? So should the cell represent A and C, which are red, B, which is blue, or D, which is green? The type closest to the center is one possibility. Again, that's the default method in encoding points to raster in ArcGIS Pro. And in this case, because D is closest to the center, the cell would take on the value D, or green in this case. Or instead, what about the most frequent category in the cell? So A and C are both red. Those occur 2 times. So that's the frequency of red. D is 1 and B is 1. So the most frequent kind is A and C, and so we use the cell as representing red. And that would be a more logical choice. And again, even with this type of encoding, you could have different weights to different categories if you know some a priori reason why, let's say, B should be more represented than A and D or C. So in that case, the most important type would be B, because we said we have knowledge about B being more important than AC, such that if a cell contains a B, then that cell should take on the attribute of B, which is blue in this case. Now, we must remember that with this type of encoding, when we're talking about subpoint issues, that's not the same as when we're looking at the minimum cell size that we need to represent a set of points as discrete entities. So this is what occurs here. What occurs here, I should say, is what often occurs when you're doing analyses with multiple layers, and you have a specific cell size that you must analyze at, since we cannot do analysis between layers that have different cell sizes. So you have an imposed cell size, and because of that imposition, you can't use the minimum nearest neighbor distances as a means by which to calculate the cell size, because you're using this within a project that uses a specific set cell size. So in that case, it's possible and highly likely that you will have less cells with categorical values coming out of the encoding process than you had points going into the categorical or into the encoding process. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. If you have a large cell size that can contain more than one point, you won't have, let's say, 100 points or 100 cells coming out that are unique for 100 points going in. You might have 100 points going in and 75 cells coming out the other end. And that can affect how you might interpret your results, so it's very important to keep in mind.